to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens.
Welcome to this episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. I'm Devonya Havis, and I'm joined by my co-hosts, Leigh Johnson and Rick Leigh. Today, we'll be talking about ambiguity. But before we get to that, let's find out what folks are drinking and whether we're ranting or raving. Rick, how about you?
I'm going to have a French 75, and today I am raving about digital medievalists. I've been working on this project, and I won't go into details, but it has to do with transcribing manuscripts and having the images and having these correlated online. And so I've been steeped in the world of work that medievalists have done to make manuscripts and early print editions available to a wider public. You know, you wouldn't think about it, but medievalists were early on in the digital world. They've done tremendous work, and I just want to shout out, because he's helped me a lot, Jeffrey Witt. If you go to Lombard Press, you'll find the work that he's done. Just remarkable stuff that medievalists are on the forefront of technology, of all things.
I mean, if I had a nickel for every time someone said medievalists are on the forefront, I'd have a nickel.
Stand down, Leigh Johnson.
And Leigh, what will you be having, and are you ranting or raving?
Well, I'm just going to have a Buffalo Trace on a rock today, and I'm ranting about being one of the boiling frogs. So there's this old anecdote, I don't think it's actually attributed to anyone. The basic story goes that if you put a frog in a pot of boiling water, I mean, okay, first of all, why would anybody do that? But this is just how it goes. But if you put a frog in a pot of boiling water, that it would immediately jump out. But that if you put a frog in a pot of water and just slowly increase the heat, that it wouldn't really realize the increase in heat until it was already dead. This has been used many times to indicate how a creeping worsening of events sometimes takes us by surprise and eventually is harmful or even deadly to us. I think that's the situation that we're in right now in the United States. We've seen over the last month and a half so many things that have just kind of been turning up the heat and turning up the heat. And not to sound too conspiratorial, but I did see this TikTok by a creator, I'm sorry, I can't remember who it was, who pointed to Trump's renaming of the Gulf of Mexico as evidence of this and said, you know, this is one of those things. Okay, let's recall the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America. And then, you know, we're going to rename other things. Maybe this is leading to renaming the United States. Maybe we call it the New America or something. And what would be the consequences of that? Well, then we can change the Constitution, because the Constitution refers to the United States and not to the New America. And okay, yes, I realize now I'm all the way down the conspiratorial hole, but it's not an unbelievable scenario to me. So I'm trying to be one of those frogs that's like, hey, frogs, it's getting hot in here.
It's getting hot in here.
But surely if Trump were to change the name of the United States, it would have Trump on it.
Right. Trump's America. Yeah, for sure. Oh, by the way, do you guys know that in the 19th century, apparently there were a ton of people who did experiments on exactly this? Like there was a German guy, Holtz, I think was his name, who was trying to find the location of the soul.
Oh, yeah.
And did this boiling frogs experiment and basically found that if you take the brain out of the frog, the frog won't jump out of the water. But if you leave the brain in the frog will jump out of the water. So anyway.
Imagine that, a brainless frog.
Science. So Devonya, what about you? What are you drinking and what are you ranting or raving about?
Today strikes me as a kind of pomegranate oolong day. It's snowy outside. I like the idea of caffeine and comfort. And this particular brand of tea comes in these wonderful balls that are, in fact, dried tea leaves. and they unfurl once they're heated up over time and return to rehydrated leaves. So it not only tastes good, it's a great aesthetic experience.
Caffeinated comfort.
Yes.
Sign me up.
And today I am raving about independent film festivals. In particular, watching The Addiction, which came out in 1995, sponsored by the Buffalo International Film Festival, that takes indie films and brings community folks together to watch them, often older films. And it's a nice community event, but also interesting to see how things do and don't bear the stamp of time. Interesting about this film was the question of addiction and how that played out during the crack epidemic. And it was also kind of fun to see 90s New York again, which always felt to me like a classroom left with a substitute in charge.
Wait, and who was that substitute? Ed Koch?
I don't know who it was at the time, but I just remember that feeling of we just need a little more order. But that might have been the freedom of New York in the 90s. Notwithstanding, it's a film also about vampires.
Oh, wow.
And oddly enough, the lead character is getting a PhD in philosophy.
Oh, of course. It's a horror film.
Well, that's what all of our parents thought.
So, we're talking about ambiguity this episode. Leigh, do you want to tell us how this is going to unfold?
Yeah, well, I think most of us like our morality the way I like my whiskey. Straight, untainted, and easy to swallow. But the truth is, moral life is more often like one of Rick's fancy cocktails, also mixed by a chaotic bartender, layered, complex, and sometimes leaving you with a bad taste in your mouth. Moral ambiguity is what happens when we find ourselves stuck between competing ethical commitments, when the old maps of right and wrong don't quite fit the terrain that we're standing on. And we like to think that we can sniff out villains and heroes easily, but life is rarely that tidy. As we've discussed in previous episodes, whether it's the ethics of whistleblowing, gray areas of political compromise, or just deciding whether or not to tell a white lie to spare someone's feelings, we're constantly navigating murky waters where the right answer isn't obvious, or worse, where every possible answer is a little bit wrong. Why do we crave certainty in a world that so often refuses to give it to us? Maybe it's because we're used to thinking of morality as a science rather than an art, something with clear rules and predictable outcomes, rather than something that we have to work out and work through. But that's not even a very good version of science, which also depends on ambiguity, right? As Thomas Kuhn argued in Structures of Scientific Revolutions, paradigm shifts occur when ambiguous data accumulates and forces us to reevaluate our fundamental assumptions. And it does also seem that we kind of like ambiguity in our art, in our music, in our literature. I'm thinking here of James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room. That novel's treatment of queerness is deliberately ambiguous in a time where a direct discussion of queerness would have been dangerous. So maybe we crave certainty because moral ambiguity forces us to take responsibility for our own choices rather than outsourcing them to some kind of universal principle or authority. But whatever the case, we're embracing our inner Kafkas today, and we're going to walk straight into the gray fog. So grab a drink, embrace the uncertainty, and let's talk about the ethics of not knowing. This episode is brought to you by our good friends at Edinburgh University Press, who have an amazing slate of new philosophy texts coming out in 2025. Make sure to visit their website at euppublishing.com, and don't forget to type in the special discount code for our listeners, HBS, when you check out. Thanks, Edinburgh University Press, for supporting public-facing philosophy. As you both know, and as listeners of this podcast know, I want to start with a definition. So I want to start by asking both of you, what, if any, difference is there between ambiguity and vagueness, or ambiguity and uncertainty.
At the risk of sounding like one of those people who starts a sentence by saying, well, actually, I wonder if it's worth dwelling on the fact that at its root, ambiguity has to do with a duality and not a multiplicity. Something is ambiguous if it could go either way, but not any which way. If I say something's ambiguous, the items that it's moving between are not vague. They're pretty well known, but it's not sure which one they're actually heading toward. So therefore, I think I can distinguish it really well from vagueness. I think when there's ambiguity, there's also necessarily uncertainty, even if there's not ambiguity every time there's uncertainty.
Devonya?
I think when you asked that, I was sort of like, I don't know. I don't know.
It's ambiguous.
And then I thought about ambivalence as a kind of positionality with respect to ambiguity. I think of vagueness in terms of clarity as something clear. You can have ambiguity even when your options or choices are clear. And vagueness, it seems to me, is a question about clarity and understanding.
Yeah, I like that. You know, Rick in a previous episode this season referred to fuzziness, and I think of vagueness more like fuzziness. I like the way that you said it. It's not clear exactly what the problem is, what the answers are, or if the problem is clear and the answers are clear, in what way they're clear, right? Or identifiable anyway.
Right.
I really appreciate, Rick, your emphasis on the ambi in ambiguous, because one of the things that I really like about the concept of ambiguity, and that's not the same as saying I like ambiguity, but one of the things I really like about the concept of ambiguity is it does remind us of what Derrida called the play of difference, that things are meaningful, things become clear only in their differentiation from other things. And when that differentiation becomes vague, I mean, for lack of a better word, that's where we get ambiguity.
For Dave, we can say with difference, the idea is that there is a letter change that is discernible on the written page, which is not fully discernible in conversation. And so I might add that positionality comes into play.
Right.
When we in English refer to this concept, we use a French pronunciation and therefore distinguish between difference and différence. Whereas in French, it's différence and différence.
Exactly, yeah.
We intone it in speaking, which Derrida developed this so it wouldn't be heard. As you pointed out, Devonya, would only be read. What's interesting there is that in the differentiating, there is a removal of ambiguity because prior to differentiating, things could go either way. The difference or differentiation separates two things from one another. And so prior to that, things weren't vague, things weren't uncertain, things were sort of standing on a razor's edge, and we didn't know whether they're going to fall on one side or on the other side. But still, we're not lost. We're not, to use a phrase we used earlier this season, we're not unmoored. We're just not sure, is it X or is it Y? But we are sure that it's X or Y and not squirrel.
Are you sure? I mean, one of the things that I like about difference, not to go down the Derrida rabbit hole, but I like the idea that what is discernible often can be tied to what one is conscious of, as well as one's epistemological communities and ways of knowing. And I think this, for me, goes back to Leigh's conversation about the boiling frog. Maybe there are some frogs that are aware that the water is getting hotter and hotter because they are more suspicious of being in a pot of water. I think positionality and consciousness play a role in how we are discerning.
I completely agree with you about positionality and consciousness playing a role in how we both perceive ambiguity and how we work our way through it. I guess I'm not really sure that ambiguity has as much epistemological heft as is often attributed to it. So, for example, if I encountered some object, some life form that was absolutely unknown to me, right? Like it didn't fit in the play of differences of things that I know. I think I would say, I don't know what this is. I would not say this is ambiguous.
Right.
I would say this is entirely novel. This is a miracle or a mystery or something like that. I wouldn't say it's ambiguous.
Right.
So for me, ambiguity seems to have to operate already within a more or less coherent epistemological system. So the ambiguity is about the way the parts of that system are working or the way decisions that have to be made about the parts of that system are working, but not is this something or is it unknown? But it's not clear what this is or if this is. So I'm thinking if we put this in the context of ambiguity in, like, let's say religious or mythological sources, one really good example is the book of Job. Does God's response to Job justify suffering or just evade the question altogether, right? I mean, there the response to Job's suffering is ambiguous. It's not vague. It's not uncertain, although maybe actually it is probably also uncertain. But it's not, do I know that this is a response?
Right.
But like, what does it mean? That's the thing. What does it mean? And I'm also thinking of Kierkegaard in Fear and Trembling when he talks about the ambiguity of the decision that Abraham had to make. So very famously, God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. And Kierkegaard wants to read that as an ambiguous decision, an ambiguous situation that Abraham finds himself in, where he has to make a decision. He has to make a certain decision, as a matter of fact. And also, by the way, he has to be certain about the decision that he makes. It doesn't remove the ambiguity of the situation.
I like that example because the various positions that Kierkegaard is assuming in discussing how Abraham is making the decision also depend upon a certain set of perspectives and what is legible from those perspectives. Granted, Kierkegaard leans into a decision that is faith-based, but it's also a decision that creates ambiguity from a moral standpoint.
And I think that's actually getting at what I was trying to say earlier about ambiguity not really having the epistemological heft that we attribute to it, because where there's ambiguity, faith is necessary, not knowledge.
But I want to think about legibility. And maybe I was being too broad in calling it epistemological, but I was drawing upon that to talk about what is legible to us within a particular episteme or set of constructs in terms of how we think about something. And that, for me, comes into play when we're talking about Kierkegaard. Are we thinking about a knight of faith, or are we thinking about a tragic hero?
I think I'm somewhere between the point that Leigh initially made and then, Devonya, your point. I would say, and this is not a book club where Fear and Trembling is the book we're discussing this week, but I would quibble, Devonya, with one way you phrased it. I would say that in that book, Abraham's decision to either kill Isaac or not kill Isaac is not faith-based, it's faith-producing. In other words, it's not on the basis of faith that Abraham makes the decision, it's the decision itself that makes him a knight of faith. That's Kierkegaard's phrase.
Yes.
And then legibility emerges precisely because of that. And I think this was part of Leigh's point, that in the moment before the decision, things are ambiguous, but I can't read either side. It's only when I make the decision that everything becomes readable in terms of where I now stand.
And I think it's important to note that part of what Kierkegaard wants to do in interpreting that story of Abraham deciding about sacrificing Isaac is that he does want to return the ambiguity to a story that has been presented with a kind of certainty.
Yeah.
Kierkegaard is telling us that we are certain about the choice because we know how it turns out, because we're not at the decision point, which strikes me as a kind of ambiguity that Leigh is working to get us to talk about.
That's such a good point. And one of my favorite things about the way Kierkegaard sets up his discussion of the sacrifice of Isaac in Fear and Trembling is that he says, look, we're told every Sunday when we sit in the pews that this is the model of faith.
Right.
We can be certain that this is the model of faith. But if we were actually certain about that, we ought to be totally offended, right? Like we ought not to be falling asleep in the pews hearing this story.
Right.
We ought to be horrified that this is the certain model of faith. Yeah, I like the way that you said that, because if we lose the ambiguity, or as Rick said, if we reverse the order of faith and the decision, then, Kierkegaard would say we become like lazy assistant professors, right? We're not really thinking through it well enough.
But I want to pull on a point Devonya made, because I think it's really crucial about ambiguity in general and not just about Kierkegaard. That is that there still is ambiguity, but not for the one who has made the decision. In other words, those of us reading the Abraham story from the outside, for us, there's still ambiguity. And Devonya said, this is really morally ambiguous. And to emphasize even more the point Leigh was making, I think that if I'm in church on Sunday and the person sitting next to me turns and says, you know what, I killed my son yesterday because God told me to, I wouldn't call this person a hero of the faith. I would call the authorities.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Or presume that they're having some kind of crisis that requires intervention, not a celebration.
Right.
If the meaning of the action is ambiguous, that is different than me finding myself in a situation where my decision points are ambiguous. So we've got the question of how do I interpret the meaning of the action, as well as the ambiguity that faces me when I need to choose an action.
Right.
And I think that problem really brings us back to what I was complaining about earlier, namely our overinvestment of epistemological concerns in the question of ambiguity. Because we all know it's been the case for 2,000 years at least that in Western philosophy, light is the model of wisdom, right? It's the metaphorical model of wisdom. And we say what philosophy aims to do, I mean, not just philosophy, religion also, science, what they all aim to do is to take us out of the dark and into the light, take us out of the vague and the uncertain and the ambiguous and into things that we can know. But that seems to presume that the world itself, the world as it is, the thing in itself, doesn't also include ambiguity. And ironically enough, light is probably the most ambiguous thing that we know of or we understand in science. I mean, is it a wave? Is it a particle? Is it both? I mean, that is truly ambiguous. So it's kind of ironic that we use light as the metaphor for dispersing with ambiguity, with vagueness, with uncertainty, when in fact, light is nature's maybe most ambiguous phenomenon.
I don't want to leave this topic without mentioning something that Devonya reminded me of, and that is this question of ambiguity seems to arise most importantly, maybe not most frequently, but most importantly when it comes to action.
Yeah.
And in the two ways that Devonya put it. On the one hand, I am forced to act in all sorts of ways. In simple ways, I have to eat, I have to drink, and there's a lot of ambiguity involved in that in the sense that I can't possibly foresee all of the rippling effects that my action is going to have. Here I think of Bart Simpson bringing, was it a frog, to Australia, and then as the plane is leaving at the end of the episode, he looks out the window and the entire continent is covered with frogs because he couldn't foresee the repercussions of his action. He flushed it down the toilet and then there was reproduction and so on, or it was pregnant or something. So we can't see the repercussions or even the meaning of our action. But then for someone looking on my action, there's the other ambiguity that Devonya pointed out, namely, it's not clear, did I mean this or did I mean that in my action? Did I intend this or did I intend that? What was behind my action? That remains ambiguous to someone outside of me. And it's these two kinds of ambiguity that Hannah Arendt, for example, will say that's just what constitutes action.
Right.
Because action, unlike physical, and this I mean in terms of physics, physical causation, the cause determines the effect, and there's a way in which we could trace that with certainty, which is why causation becomes so important in theories of knowledge. Whereas action begins something, and it begins something without a chain behind it, and what it begins is ambiguous.
Enjoying the conversation? Let's connect. Whether you're in the mood for a spicy debate or just want to say hi, we're all over the internet. Find us on Facebook at Hotel Bar Sessions Podcast, on Twitter and Blue Sky at Hotel Bar Podcast, and catch our latest videos on YouTube and TikTok at Hotel Bar Sessions. Want even more? Our website, hotelbarpodcast.com, is your one-stop shop for all things Hotel Bar Sessions. Follow us, tag us, and join the fun.
So I'd like to maybe bring this down to our feelings about ambiguity, and in particular, why we struggle so much with ambiguity. Because, there's this Ellsberg paradox that basically says that people prefer known risks over ambiguous ones, even when ambiguity might be advantageous for us. And I am definitely one of those people. I'd always say I would rather know than not know. 100% in every situation, no matter how bad the news is, I would rather know. And I think that that's because, like most people, at least it seems, I find ambiguity uncomfortable. I find myself leaning into tendencies to maybe oversimplify, but at least to seek binary options to any kind of decision that I have to make. So I kind of want us to talk about that discomfort for just a second.
I think often on this topic about the comedian David Brenner. He was once on the Johnny Carson show, and this was in the days where the first guest would go down the couch as subsequent guests would come on. And so he was already at the end, and he's kind of daydreaming. And there was a guy Johnny was talking to, was an author, wrote a book about heroes or something. And all of a sudden, all David Brenner hears is, "David?" And he knew that Johnny asked him a question and he didn't hear it. And so he said, "Oh, in what sense do you mean?" And Johnny said, "Well, who do you think the greatest hero of history is?" And David Brenner said, "I think the first person to drink milk." And the reason is because here we all are standing in front of the cave, and a cow walks by and someone says, "You see those things there? I'm going to pull it, and whatever comes out, I'm going to drink it." So what gets me thinking is how it is that human beings ever came to know certain things were edible and other things weren't. Like the trial and error and so on. Now, add to the fact that some of those things are poisonous. When it comes to that, I don't want any ambiguity. One time I was in Poland and a friend of mine was a big mushroomer. She's like, "Hey, let's go out in the forest and gather mushrooms." I'm like, "Okay, fine." And so we go out and then we get back and she's like, "Oh, I'm going to make this thing with mushrooms." I said, "Well, go ahead, but I'm not eating it." She's like, "Why?" And I'm like, "There's a whole lot of ambiguity about those mushrooms right now. And I do not want to eat them." And so I think, as both of you pointed out earlier, this need for classifying and ordering and making things clear is part and parcel with survival to a large extent. And that's one reason why I think we're so worried when ambiguity is involved.
I do think a lot of it is about survival, and I love the example of the first person to drink milk. But I think it's also about pleasure. I mean, in the same way that we had to figure out what can we eat that will sustain us as opposed to what can we eat that's going to kill us. A lot of our experimentation with food and ingesting nature has been like, will it get me high?
Well, you remember there are three things that we're mostly interested in it. Can I eat it? Can I fuck it? Or will it kill me?
Well, I just want to add, will it get me high to that?
Oh, yeah, that's right.
I'm sliding away from that line of conversation. To the entertainment question, if we know it, there's a way in which it's boring and not interesting. We don't want to know how the book ends. We don't want someone to give away the cliffhanger. And in movies, the psychological thrillers are interesting precisely because they are ambiguous. If we think about a film like Doubt, Doubt is compelling because of the ambiguity. There are more than two ways to interpret it, but there are at least two ways. Even though we seek certainty, the human condition is a condition of existing in ambiguity, also in uncertainty. In many ways, these classifications are often a hedge and sometimes a problematic hedge against the chaos of the world, so to speak.
We have different levels of tolerance for ambiguity in different aspects of our life. Obviously, if my life is on the line, if I'm trying to survive, I want as little ambiguity as possible. I think probably for most people in moral decision making, they want as little ambiguity as possible. But as you said, in art and film and literature, we have a pretty high tolerance for ambiguity and, in fact, want ambiguity in those situations. And this reminds me of a point that Judith Butler made in her Gender Trouble book. And I think this is a fundamental queer theory point, which is that it matters where the ambiguity is happening, like how tolerant we're going to be towards it. Judith Butler famously used this example of saying, yeah, everybody's fine with a drag queen when they're on a stage, but they're not fine with the drag queen when they're sitting beside them on the subway. Now it's not a performance. Now it's ambiguous. Now it's, what are you? How am I supposed to respond to you, et cetera. In the same way that we talk about ambiguity, we could also think about queerness.
Right.
Queerness is a kind of ambiguity. And one of the things that we're seeing increasingly is that there's this push, especially in the United States, to lower our tolerance for queerness when it comes to politics and morality, despite the fact that we still seem to be mostly okay with it in art and literature and film.
I think it's interesting in this to look at two different forms of art, because I don't want to lose, Leigh, your point about the pleasure in knowing. So there's an affective dimension. And I think about an old-fashioned kind of murder mystery, Sherlock Holmes, Agatha Christie, or even Columbo, where at the end, when we know either who did it or we know now how Columbo's going to prove that they did it, we have a kind of relief. Oh, I see. And there's a pleasure in that, especially if I was able to guess that ahead of time. And then there are works of art, like Doubt, I think, is a really, really good example. By the end of that movie, we don't know whether the priest was involved in something nefarious or not. I don't want to spoil it, but come on, it's 20 years old now, isn't it?
Yeah. This is the Philip Seymour Hoffman film, for those of you who don't know about it, but we'll put a link in the show notes.
There, we return back to a very classical notion that in drama in particular, but maybe other works of art as well, what we like about the ambiguity is that it does stage for us the human condition. And because we're seeing the human condition staged, we can see how others play this out or how this plays out for others. Either way, we have some examples that we can look at and say, oh, crap, I would never do that. What are you doing? So I think we do take pleasure in knowing, but I also think aesthetically we take pleasure in ambiguity because it helps us wrestle with the ambiguities we're faced with all the time.
Not to be Debbie Downer here, but I also want to point out that there's another kind of taking pleasure in ambiguity that is coercive, exploitative. You know, when you think about the ambiguity of the phrase in the U.S. Constitution, necessary and proper, the necessary and proper clause. Well, does that limit governmental power or does that expand governmental power? I mean, there are people interested in power that want to preserve that ambiguity to exploit it.
Right.
Same way in contract law or corporate PR or institutional HR, right? Like we want to leave some ambiguity in the rules so that that ambiguity can be exploited. But the ambiguity can only be exploited by the people who already have the power and against the people who might want to use that ambiguity to gain power.
As you make that point, I was thinking about Diane Duane's Wizard's Holiday, where the wizards are engaging with the lone power, and the lone power is associated with entropy, which often stands in for evil in that series of novels. In this particular novel on Wizard's Holiday, they encounter the lone power who is ambiguous. And one of the things the lone power says is, I have leaned into ambivalence because people can see pure evil coming. And ambivalence allows people to delay their moral decision because they can claim that they are uncertain or confused or they don't quite get it or that a decision is not necessary. And the lone power's argument is there's a way in which ambivalence then works to produce the effect of evil, even among people who are not necessarily committing to a moral evil.
Right.
Sometimes the failure to make a decision or the failure to act, because it is ambiguous, leads us to consequences that we might define as evil.
It's because of this problem with ambiguity and power that we, when we were kids, changed the rules of a game called Catch One, Catch All. For those of you who don't know, it's like it or tag, except you remain it throughout the game until everyone is it. And so like at first it's one person, and then if they catch someone, then it's two, and so on and so on. So you don't really know, seeing someone, are they it or not? Should I run from them or are they friends? And so we developed a rule that if you were asked, you had to tell the truth. So the idea was like, if I'm close enough to ask you, are you it? You could start running at me and say, yes, I am. But we didn't like that ambiguity of, I see you half a block away and I'm not sure. And so we tried to insert a clarity. We tried to insert a decision and a classification in this ambiguity precisely because if we didn't, the people who are it could play on that ambiguity to catch the rest of us. Are humans responsible for climate change? Well, some people in power say, it's hard to tell. You know, the evidence isn't in. It could go either way. Are there weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? Well, we don't really know. It could go either way, so we better go in and make sure. In those cases of ambiguity, I think you're right that power does step in to make a decision when ambiguity forces a certain kind of indecisiveness.
Yeah, this is making me think about our last conversation about trust. In a situation that is ambiguous, we feel unmoored. We don't know what the rules are. Somebody might change the rules. We don't know what to do. And we don't even really know who to trust. And that's one of the things that makes us crave certainty more than tolerate ambiguity, because it's so easily exploitable. And I think, to be 100% honest, the right has really mastered the rhetoric of ambiguity. When you just look at phrases like "Make America Great Again" or "All Lives Matter," I mean, they shouldn't be ambiguous, but they are ambiguous. We can see how they could be easily exploited. We can see how they could be true. We can see how they could be false at the same time. And yeah, we can't overlook that part of our aversion to ambiguity is that ambiguity is so often exploited in the interest of power.
I would think about it in terms of improvisation or blue notes. The ambiguity comes within a schematic relational framework that allows us to make sense of what's happening. Like if you're engaged in improvising with an ensemble, you're doing it often within a particular key in relation to a particular work in conjunction with the people with whom you're playing. Going back to your example of queerness, a blue note is a sliding transition responding to European musical notation. Queerness is often a response to things that are binary and fixed. And I think the unmooring is when those relational points are shifted. So that what seemed to be a clear set of relations, it's not only that someone is changing the rules, they're changing the rules by changing the sets of relations.
I think that's a really good point. And I didn't mean to say that ambiguity could only be exploited for oppressive purposes. It could also be exploited for liberatory purposes.
Right.
One person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, right? Hey there, barflies. We don't often say stop listening, but I'm asking you to press pause right now on this episode and help us out. If you haven't already done so, go to hotelbarsessions.patreon.com to support this podcast. It's easy, it's cheap. We have several levels of sponsorship available, and for less than the cost of a round of drinks per month, you could help us cover our production costs and keep serving up these straight shots of wisdom every week. Not ready to commit to a Patreon sponsorship just yet? No worries. You can still support the podcast by visiting our website at hotelbarpodcast.com. Click on the Support Us page, where you can make one-time donations via PayPal, Cash App, and Venmo. While you've got us on pause, double-check that you're following Hotel Bar Sessions on social media. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. Share our posts with your friends and let us know what you think about each new episode. We honestly never expected this podcast to grow as much or as fast as it did. But thank you all for listening. Please consider throwing a few bucks in our tip jar.
I think it's really interesting the way in which our fear or uneasiness, at the very least, of ambiguity is related to power. For a paper I was giving some years ago, I started doing research on the number of humans who are born without genitals that could be clearly classified by the binaries that we tend to go with, male, female. It turns out that it's not a huge number, but it's about the same number as redheads.
Yeah.
Which is a large number.
Yeah.
And up until, in fact, very recently, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is still going on, that was corrected almost immediately and frequently without the knowledge of the mother.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There you see the power of the medical profession coming to bear in a situation of ambiguity, saying, this cannot stand.
Right.
A decision has to be made, and they're making it. I think if we pause for a moment and say, okay, so what's wrong there? Couldn't we just let things go? What's the source of that uneasiness? Power steps into this and makes a decision.
And in the cases you note, makes a decision often historically based on what is most easily correctable from the standpoint of plastic surgery. Right. So it's not even a decision based on how one might live one's life, as if you could decide that for a newborn.
Right.
But it is a kind of pragmatic decision based on how medicine can intervene.
If ambiguity is exploited by power for nefarious reasons, Leigh, you mentioned, and Devonya, you as well, that it can also be a tool of resistance. And I think, Devonya, you even raised examples of what I would call aesthetic resistance.
Mm-hmm.
That makes it sound like ambiguity is ambiguous. And that makes me uncomfortable to have the very concept itself be an enactment of itself.
So ambiguity being ambiguous makes you uncomfortable, Rick.
Yes.
You want more certainty and ambiguity.
I want some decisiveness here.
Decisive ambiguity.
Well, I think in any system of meaning, there are going to be meanings that are forced, therefore allow for intervention. Right? You know, I mean, this is ultimately what Derrida means by difference, that in any text and any system of meaning, there are going to be remainders and margins and traces. In ambiguous places, we do have to force meaning. We have to make a decision. We have to interpret. Because in that sense, the meaning is forced, it does allow for intervention and reinterpretation, recontextualization. And so there are places that we can intervene in ambiguity and force a meaning that is either liberatory or oppressive. But I don't think that whether an intervention is going to be liberatory or oppressive is given already.
And I also feel that the idea of play here is important. Often when we're thinking about uses of ambiguity that are resistant, they are uses of ambiguity playing with fixed knowledge. And in some ways, I take Leigh to be talking about ways of recontextualizing how we interpret the meaning of something as those kinds of interventions. Namely, we're playing with a set of possibilities that might not have seemed to be a set of possibilities. They may have appeared to be fixed, but in fact, they're actually more ambiguous than we'd be led to believe.
That makes me think, though, that it's not that ambiguity is resistive, but rather the resistance comes once there's a forced meaning. I think you could go back to our episode on queerness with Del McWhorter many seasons ago, where taking on the term queer as an act of resistance, owning it as an act of resistance, it is playful for sure, but it's playful in relation to something that has been determined and therefore is not at the moment ambiguous.
Right.
Or to put it a different way, it's a way of, if I could create a verb, ambiguizing that which is certain, definite, classified, and categorized.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, there is a verb there, ambiguating, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that is, in fact, what queer theory does, is it ambiguates.
Right.
It ambiguates binaries, not just gender binaries, but binaries of all sorts. I agree with you, Rick, that when we interpret something, what interpretation is doing is removing ambiguity.
Right.
There are other ways that we can address systems of meaning in which our aim is to introduce ambiguity where it is not present. I think that for the last 25 years or so in academia, we've seen that second sense of introducing ambiguity, not interpreting, has been mostly read as liberatory scholarly activities. And it might be the case that we're getting to the point now where some people are saying, I'm tired of queering texts, right? Like I'm tired of calling things into question, right? Like I'm tired of problematizing. We need more interpretation. We need more positing. It is the case that we're always going back and forth between these situations of clarity and ambiguity. Both activities can be liberatory or non-liberatory.
Both activities of intervening and ambiguating.
Both activities of ambiguating and interpreting, or ambiguating and deciding. And let's say ambiguating and clarifying.
There have always been other ways of thinking through things. Mm-hmm. They just are not acknowledged in certain, I'll call them knowledge systems. Mm-hmm. And for me, that becomes the liberatory point where we are increasing the options of understanding because we're generating a greater range of interpretive possibilities, as opposed to saying this one or these two are the only legitimate forms of knowing.
I think this goes back to the issue that where there's ambiguity, power can always step in and decide. Because I think the re-ambiguating is an act of resistance precisely against that power of having decided. In a very simple way, if I'm reading a text by Immanuel Kant, and I say, when Kant says, always act in such a way that the maximum of your action can be a universal rule for all, I say that he means by this X. There, I'm disambiguating something that could be ambiguous and we could argue over. And I think deconstructive readings or queer readings, which I think are very closely related to deconstructive readings, what they say is the ambiguity is ineliminable. At the point where the text seems most decisive of all, there still is ambiguity present, and we need to tease out the way in which this decisiveness is actually indecisive. I like that. But I do also see, Leigh, your point about, this gets tedious and it seems as if it's not getting us anywhere concretely, practically, politically. So we engage in a kind of academic politics, but meanwhile, in the street, in the White House, in Congress, things are not being affected by this. And so we need another form of action, engage another kind of knowing that allows, and I love this term you use, Leigh, positing. We are positing, which is a different way of knowing than ambiguating. Both are forms of knowing, but I think we need both of them. I don't want when J.D. Vance goes to a meeting of European security leaders and says the U.S. is no longer interested in defending the sovereign boundaries of any country. I don't want that to remain ambiguous and then we play a both-siderism game here. I want to say that's wrong.
Yeah, I mean, J.D. Vance is not queering the borders. That's not what he's doing. When he's positing something, right? I 1,000,000% agree with you. At the risk of oversimplifying entire traditions of scholarly work, that is to say, making them less ambiguous in a way that I would like to see the ambiguity preserved.
Yeah.
I do think that this is one thing that we can see in the difference between, for example, the discourse of queer theory and the discourse of decolonial theory. So although both of them are deeply dependent on, and I would say in many ways inheritors of, the deconstructive tradition, I do think that what we see in queer theory is largely an interest in positing ambiguity, where it was thought to be non-ambiguous. Whereas I think in decolonial theory, what we see is, no, we want even less ambiguity, right? We want to say, no, actually, what we took as clear is clear, but in a way entirely different than what it posited.
Right.
And I guess I believe that the positing often comes through unsettling what we thought were fixed things. I also want to express a concern with removing ambiguity. I don't think I want all sorts of ambiguity, but I do want to problematize the elimination of ambiguity. And I'm thinking about this in terms of the politics of recognition and what it means to be recognized with certain identities. And here I think about trying to construct Blackness as this narrow thing in opposition to whiteness. The idea of recognizing it is difficult. Appealing for a certain kind of recognition seems to me to demand that we make it less ambiguous in ways that are problematic for the constitution of whatever the content of that is.
There, I think I want to go back to Leigh's point that it's not the ambiguity that's doing the work of knowledge, that's doing the work of epistemology. It's being deployed to undo a certain kind of knowing, but it's not doing the work of knowing. And I don't know if this is what you meant, Leigh, but this is one way of understanding that ambiguity doesn't really do epistemological work.
Yeah, that is what I meant. I think that in some ways, I might describe doing epistemological work as sort of scaling our tolerance for ambiguity.
Okay.
Right? So I can say, I understand what the point of that novel was or what the meaning of that movie was. There's still a high level of tolerance for ambiguity in me saying, I know what that movie's about, or I know what that artwork is about. That's fine. I'm fine with that, right? But I think that I might want to also say there are many, many, many things in my life that I would like to see the tolerance for ambiguity brought down to exactly zero. Like, I don't think there should be ambiguity about, for example, does a person have to be able to afford to live? I think that's a non-ambiguous question.
Meaning it should be yes. People need living wages.
Yeah, not it should be. It is. It's not ambiguous.
I guess I want to ask you, because I'm intrigued by this notion that the epistemological work is not being done by ambiguity. The ambiguity is opening the door for a certain kind of epistemological work.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting kind of distinction, right? If we introduce in the possibility of ambiguity, the ambiguity itself is not a knowledge, but it makes possible a kind of knowing.
I don't think I can say it any better than you just said it. Yeah, ambiguity is not doing epistemological work, but it is opening the door for epistemological work to be done.
I think a good example of this is the executive order that the president recently signed dealing with trans people in the military, in which there are two claims made at the same time, neither of which are ambiguous. One is that there are two biological sexes. Every single person has one or the other. And someone who doesn't abide by this gender binary is threatening troop cohesion. Now, I would like to ambiguate that, not as a form of knowing, but to use a phrase from medieval mystics, as a form of unknowing that then might lead to other knowledges, having the space to come in and re-clarify things in a way that is not oppressive.
Yeah.
Hey, Hotel Bar Session listeners, this is Rick Leigh. Do you know what kind of pillow I use or mattress I sleep on? No, of course you don't. And that's because we don't have any of those stupid ads for pillows or mattresses or any other crap that you don't even want. We are supported by you, our listeners. And if you want to keep our late night conversations flowing, why not do the equivalent of buying us a drink or giving us a high five? You could subscribe to our podcast at Patreon. That's patreon.com/hotelbarsessions. And you could subscribe at many levels. And hey, there's perks at those levels. You could get a coffee mug, or I might even call you out on an episode, or you could get early access to some of our episodes. There are lots of perks there, and we could really use your help. So go to patreon.com/hotelbarsessions and subscribe at any level you feel comfortable with. In the meantime, we'll see you back at the bar.
Per usual, and this is not ambiguous, our bartender has given us last call, so we've got to get out of here. But before we do, as usual, I do want to ask you if you have any final thoughts, and I want these to be as clear and unambiguated as you could possibly make them so that I can leave the bar today with certainty about your positions. But Devonya, let me go to you first.
Well, I'm struck by, and what emerged for me in this conversation is a sense of ambiguity opening the door for epistemological work. And I've got to say, as someone who enjoys complicating what students often believe to be fixed in the classroom, I really like that, because I do think that the possibilities for opposing coercive power in many ways comes from our capacity to develop knowledges and skills that allow us to push back.
Rick?
First of all, I think that turning the bright fluorescent lights on after last call has been made is one of the clearest examples of disambiguation that I could possibly marshal, in which we're then all left to look at what we've become. There's a moment that I would like to stay in a little bit of ambiguity, I think. I have to admit, going in, I didn't think I had a lot to say about ambiguity. We didn't talk about de Beauvoir, but like the ethics of ambiguity, I thought, okay, well, I could talk about that for 2 minutes. But I've come to see it is an incredibly important subject to think of because, as Leigh, you pointed out, although you didn't use these terms, it's a moment where our emotions or affects come into play in really strong ways and can sometimes lead or take the lead in that moment and lead us to positions that are in advance of or independent of even our knowledge. As the guys on Car Talk used to say, independent of the actual thought process. And I really like thinking about the way in which ambiguity is so tied up with affects. It's worth thinking very seriously about it in relation to politics and sociality.
I suppose I just want to end by saying that I think we have a lot to learn from the youngs on this one. I think the younger folks today are playful, seriously playful, in a way that has been progressive and liberatory, and we have a lot to learn from them. I'm thinking about the way that they play with language, memes, their understanding of gender and relationships and their identity as workers and as citizens. There's just been a lot of ambiguation, but ambiguation in a way that is progressive and liberatory that I certainly have a lot to learn from. I think a lot of us have to learn from. So, yeah, let's listen to the youngins for a little bit. All right, guys. Well, I've appreciated this conversation. I do weirdly feel clearer on the subject now. So I will catch you next time.
Take care.
Bye.